Hi everyone, welcome to episode 15 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. I'm Kevin, an Associate Research Fellow at USP.
Hi, this is Adrian, also with USP.
And we'll be your host for this episode on US-Taiwan policy and cross-strait relations with Professor Taylor Fravel. As US-China competition heats up, one area of concern for security scholars is that of a potential conflict over Taiwan. Some US scholars and analysts have suggested that the US should abandon its long-standing approach of strategic ambiguity in favor of strategic clarity. Meanwhile, Chinese officials and scholars have expressed increasing concern about changes in the US One-China policy that have already occurred. What do these trends mean, and what can we expect from Washington and Beijing, especially in the year ahead? Joining us to discuss this issue is Taylor Fravel, the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and Director of Security Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. He is also rounding off a visit to RSIS as our S. Rajaratnam Professor in Strategic Studies, and we're eager to hear what he has to say about US-Taiwan policy. Thank you for speaking with us, Professor.
Oh, very happy to be here today.
Hi, Professor Fravel. Maybe we can begin with this idea of strategic ambiguity, and where does this come from?
Sure. So strategic ambiguity is essentially a core part of what is described as the US One-China policy. Mm-hmm. And here it's important to distinguish the US One-China policy from China's One-China principle, just so that listeners are aware that there is actually a very significant difference here. Mm-hmm. Right. So the Chinese sort of One-China principle basically says Taiwan's an inalienable part of China, and the PRC government is the sole legal government representing all of China. Now, the U.S. One-China policy goes back to rapprochement in the early 1970s and the way in which that was handled, but essentially includes the U.S. acknowledgement of China's position, but not an acceptance of it. It does include U.S. recognition of the PRC as the sole legal government of China, but leaves China somewhat ambiguously defined. But it also includes an abiding interest in the peaceful settlement of what in 1972 was called the Taiwan Question. And in the Taiwan Relations Act that was passed later, it also includes commitments, right, that the normalization of ties with China rests on the expectation that Taiwan's future will be determined by peaceful means, and that the U.S. government would view the use of non-peaceful means as a threat to peace and security in the Pacific and of grave concern to the United States. Elements of the U.S. One-China policy under the TRA also include the U.S. commitment to maintaining unofficial ties with Taiwan and including the sale of defensive weapons. So nowhere in here did I mention strategic ambiguity, right? But it's a key part of the policy, which is to say, although the U.S. would view non-peaceful means as a threat and of grave concern, it doesn't state in the language of the Taiwan Relations Act exactly how it will respond. This is meant to be the core idea of strategic ambiguity. And it's part of a broader approach of what is often described as dual deterrence, right? Trying to deter China from using force against Taiwan and then trying to deter Taiwan from pursuing its own kind of unilateral actions, perhaps in the context of pursuing independence, right? That might be viewed as sort of provoking the mainland. So the U.S. maintains sort of ambiguity to maintain this dual kind of deterrence relationship.
Great. Thanks, Professor. So why do you think there are now greater calls in Washington to move away from strategic ambiguity towards, what is referred to as strategic clarity?
Well, I think it's a function of China's growing pressure on Taiwan, right? Simply put. So there's military pressure, diplomatic pressure, some economic pressure. But from the military perspective, right, this is most visible in terms of the incursions of PLA Air Force fighter jets right into Taiwan's air defense identification zone amid a much broader and quite significant modernization of the PLA. In political terms, right, one can look at two elements. First, China's efforts since roughly 2016 to further reduce the number of countries that recognize Taiwan as the Republic of China and thus an independent state. So it's now down to 12, which is really quite remarkable. It wasn't that high in 2016, but nevertheless, pretty significant decline. And then also politically, right, Xi Jinping has made statements suggesting that there might be a timeline, however vague, for pursuing unification. And so he's referred to not passing this problem down from generation to generation. He's also linked national rejuvenation, which is meant to be achieved sometime in mid-century with unification. And so it looks like China's adopting a much more forward, assertive, coercive policy towards Taiwan. in spite of strategic ambiguity, and therefore a different approach would be needed. This is strategic clarity, and this is the idea that the United States should make an unequivocal, high-level sort of official commitment, right, to defend Taiwan in the case of a Chinese attack. And so the idea here is this would better deter China than sort of the focus on strategic ambiguity that, looking back historically, has been quite successful over the past 4 decades.
Well then, Professor, I'd just like to ask, President Biden has been kind of known for making these off-the-cuff statements about whether the US would support Taiwan in the event of hostilities. Does this kind of overlap with the idea of strategic clarity, or is it something a bit different?
So I think it's something a bit different, and it's what I call plausible deniable clarity.
Oh, okay.
Which is to say, in these 4 interviews, I think the first was in August of 2021 and the last was in September of 2022, the president seemed to make sort of unequivocal statements that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense in the event of a Chinese attack. And he phrased it in different ways. They all came in the context of interviews, so he wasn't reading talking points. And in each case, right, his staff would then very quickly deny that there had been any change in the U.S. one China policy. And so I understand this in a couple of different ways. One, given President Biden's more general demeanor and approach, he's sort of reflecting his personal view when he's in these kinds of interview settings, and kind of his sort of gut instinct, which is that he probably believes the U.S. would get involved. But also, because it's in this interview context, and then you have the very quick denials, he's not trying to introduce a change in U.S. policy. And in fact, there is some interesting precedent for this. So back in 2001, President George W. Bush, right, said that the U.S. would do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan, again, in an interview setting, which seemed to sort of be quite similar to what Biden was doing, though Biden did it many more times than Bush did. But then in 2003, he, in a much more official policy statement, right, said that the U.S. would oppose unilateral changes to the status quo by either side, which I think was a more formal kind of articulation of what was coming out of that interview. So in one sense, Biden is in some ways repeating what was sort of a new addition to the U.S. one China policy in terms of opposition to unilateral changes to the status quo, but in the new context, right, of much greater China's assertiveness, and in the context of the debate over strategic clarity, which kind of begins in 2020, it appeared as if Biden was perhaps leaning in this other direction. The reason why I describe it as plausible deniable clarity is that I think it was hinting at Biden's own preferences, but not going so far as to pursue an official sort of change of policy.
So if I could follow up on that, we are now in the midst of a very exciting, heated presidential election, and with President Biden stepping aside, right? So how do you see strategic ambiguity developing, right? Either in a future Harris-Walz administration or a second Trump administration?
Terrific question. So I think in a Harris-Walz administration, we would probably see roughly a continuation of the current policy approach. It, I think, took the Biden administration some time to kind of settle into its approach to cross-straits relations, but it's been settled. And because it's been a key focus, right, of both of the in-person meetings between Biden and Xi, it will likely, I think, continue into a Harris administration. There are no signs that Xi would have a radically different approach to China policy overall, much less over Taiwan. Of course, there may be smaller adjustments. I think if we turn to Trump, though, it's very hard to predict because he's unpredictable. His personal statements suggest that Taiwan has stolen the U.S. semiconductor industry, and that the U.S. provides free insurance to Taiwan that they don't pay anything for, which sort of suggests that if Taiwan doesn't really step up, then the U.S. might not be willing to step in the event of a major crisis. Who knows what he will say that could be perceived as moving closer to strategic clarity. But again, I think his own instincts are not to be so sort of roughly tied to these policy concepts. On the other hand, I think within people who appear to be competing to play a significant foreign policy role in his administration, you could see within some groups greater sympathy for this idea of strategic clarity because they're seized with the problem of how to sort of, quote, restore deterrence, right, with respect to China's approach to Taiwan. Whether or not President Trump, right, would embrace that advice, I think is an open question. And obviously there's a very big gap between what he thinks and whether or not he adopts the advice that he's given. And I don't think we've necessarily seen a very clear correlation between those two dimensions in the previous administration. So I wish I could say more, or I could be more precise, but it's very hard. I think that this is kind of the nature of a Trump presidency, is that it's unpredictable.
So in that context, I would like to ask you, what do you make of Washington's attempts to get Taiwan to adopt the so-called porcupine strategy? And how do you see China and the PLA reacting to this porcupine strategy?
So I think the porcupine strategy, right, which essentially seeks to make Taiwan much harder to conquer, is a terrific military strategy for Taiwan to adopt to enhance its own defense. And in fact, this idea has been around for a very long time, right? It goes back to an article by Bill Murray, I think in the Naval War College Review in 2008. Don't quote me on the year, but this is not a new idea. I think it was reflected in Li Shiming's overall defense concept from 2017, which sadly I think was then abandoned subsequently by Taiwan. But if one is thinking about how to defend an island, right, making it very challenging to conquer through focusing on essentially asymmetric capabilities, sort of large numbers of mobile anti-ship missiles, large numbers of mobile anti-aircraft missiles, mining of the beaches and harbors, but not essentially pursuing the high-end, call them flashier military capabilities like, occasionally here Taiwan wants to buy the F-35. That would seem to be a lot of money that wouldn't necessarily bolster Taiwan's defense in the same way. So I actually think it's probably the best military strategy for Taiwan to adopt, along with significantly enhancing its reserve forces, right, which would have to play a very significant role in a porcupine strategy, because you're trying to essentially engage in a defense in depth to the degree that there's depth in Taiwan, but you need a lot of people to sort of make that work. I think China does not seem to respond directly to the porcupine strategy as much as to the U.S. effort to help Taiwan strengthen its defense, right? And so that simply has been a longstanding concern. And so whether the U.S. was pushing Taiwan to adopt a porcupine strategy or a forward defense or, offensive strikes in the mainland, China would oppose it, right? And so I think they are less focused, at least publicly, on the particulars. That said, I think it's probably the most worrisome strategy for China, because it's one that would enable Taiwan to survive the longest and would likely greatly frustrate, at least in the context of an invasion. Right? I'm not sure the porcupine strategy really is a counter-invasion strategy. Also, if we look at Ukraine's effort, right, to neutralize the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, there are all sorts of interesting ways in which the porcupine strategy could be adopted that were not conceived, 15 years ago, namely using all of these unmanned underwater or unmanned sort of very small naval vessels, essentially sort of surface torpedoes, right, to attack Chinese ships in the Strait. And so there are lots of other ways in which I think that strategy could be fleshed out in light of what we've learned about sort of Ukrainian efforts in targeting the Russian Navy.
Speaking of Ukraine, actually, one of the lessons I think from the recent struggles that Ukraine has faced is that manpower, not just equipment and ammunition, is going to be a very important factor when it comes to organizing things like defense in depth or any other kind of operations. But that's something that Taiwan's also struggled with, right? Getting enough reserves and ensuring that the current batch of conscripts are trained properly.
Yes. Taiwan used to be like Singapore in that it had 2-year conscription. And then it, I think, was reduced to 1 year, and then it was reduced to 4 months. Yeah. And now it's back to 1 year. But I think this, unfortunately, had a long-term strategic effect of diminishing significantly the quality of Taiwan's reserve forces for the period in which the conscription was reduced. And so I think it is quite important in terms of thinking about Taiwan's future defense, right, to ensure that it has sort of the largest possible and most competent, capable reserve force that it can generate. And that, I think, might require, this is probably an unpopular view, but it might require even more than 1 year. If you look at countries that are in what I would call very sort of harsh security environments, you see, whether it's Korea, Israel, Singapore, Finland, you see a greater focus on kind of building up those kinds of reserves. And unfortunately, conscription is sort of the easiest way to do that. So I think this is going to be a very serious challenge for Taiwan in the short to medium term. In the long term, they can certainly address it, but it would require, I think, making even greater changes now.
That does bring to mind something else, Professor. I'd like to ask about the timelines then. When it comes to US policy on Taiwan, one of the things that has popped up in recent years has been this discussion of a 2027 kind of deadline by which China is preparing to acquire the capability to invade Taiwan. How much does this consideration factor into US policy planning with regard to Taiwan, and how seriously do they take it?
Great question. We could talk for a very long time about 2027. In brief, right, in late November 2020, at the fourth plenum, the document that was issued sort of included for the first time that the PLA should make significant progress towards modernization by the year 2027. This subsequently, I think, came to be understood as a deadline that China had set for the PLA to be ready, right, to invade Taiwan by that date. Bill Burns, who's the head of the CIA, released this intelligence, although he also noted that China had made no decision to invade by this date, right? Only that she had called on the PLA to be ready. And so I took this more as, or my interpretation was, 2027 sort of became a focal point for achieving significant progress in the modernization of the PLA towards the 2035 milestone, right, that had been included in the 19th Party Congress Work Report. But I think others viewed it as really a deadline that had been set by China. I think also within sort of the U.S. Defense Department, not only has China now been identified as the pacing threat, but I think 2027 has been sort of the deadline by which the U.S. should have all sorts of capabilities in place to be able to better handle potential Chinese military action. And so it's really taken on a life of its own, and it has become, I think, a useful focal point both for the PLA and for the U.S. Department of Defense to achieve their respective modernization objectives.
I'm just curious, would the majority of policymakers in Washington see it as kind of a broad time target in mind, or do some of them treat it as, this really firm date by which the risk of an invasion dramatically increases?
So there are different views here, I think, in Washington. So there's a Washington view which says China faces a closing window of opportunity because of the way in which U.S. is increasing its capabilities. And so once this new suite of U.S. capabilities is in place, it will be much harder for China to take action against the island. But this, to me, appears to be, or those who make this argument are imposing, I think, their own logic on Chinese decision-making, which is to say, I have seen very little from China to suggest that they believe that they face a closing window of opportunity, right? In fact, it sort of may even be the opposite, which is to say China doesn't believe that it's ready now. We look at sort of the high-level corruption campaigns, right, within the rocket force, targeting to former ministers of defense. We see the more recent reorganization of the Strategic Support Force, which was disbanded, and 3 separate forces were constructed. And when we see continuing sort of emphasis on the need to really improve the PLA's ability to conduct joint operations, right, which would be central in military action against Taiwan. So I don't think China views itself as facing this closing window, but I think the U.S. believes that because of what it's now doing, China should believe that it faces a closing window. So it's sort of become a circular logic, right, that makes 2027 even more of an important deadline. But I think the official, if one looks at when Burns talked about Xi Jinping's statement, I think if that's sort of the official interpretation of 2027, then it does not also reflect this closing windows logic, right? It simply says that Xi Jinping has called on the PLA to be ready by this important milestone. Of course, if Xi Jinping thinks that PLA modernization is lagging, which he probably does, then it's important to have even more milestones for making progress as a way of kind of rallying the force, right, to overcome whatever obstacles it's facing. But Burns, right, in his interview with CNN, right, he was very clear to say that there has been no decision has been made, nor did he suggest that China was facing this idea of a closing window of opportunity in which it would need to act before it would no longer be able to act. And if one looks at the longer trends, even though the countermeasures that the U.S. is putting in place are quite significant, right? In a longer sense, right, geography and modernization continue to favor China more than they favor the United States because of Taiwan's close proximity to the mainland.
Thank you.
Speaking of, windows of opportunities and focal points, there have been some analysts that seek to tie Taiwan's fate, any contingency in the Taiwan Strait to what is happening in the Russo-Ukraine war. I would like to ask you, instead of, what do you make of this attempts to twin Taiwan to the Ukraine?
I think from an analytical standpoint, they make strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
Right, which is because the strategic circumstances are quite different, and the U.S. relationship with Ukraine and Taiwan is quite different. In other words, I think the U.S. has shown all along would be much more committed to Taiwan's defense than it was necessarily to Ukraine's defense, even though I think it is committed. I don't want to suggest that it isn't, right? I mean, the U.S. is spending a considerable effort, right, to help Ukraine to defend itself. But with Taiwan, right, it goes back to normalization, the Taiwan Relations Act, what we talked about at the beginning, right? I mean, although Taiwan is not a treaty ally, right, the Taiwan Relations Act uses some treaty-like language. So I want to be very clear, not an ally, not a formal ally. Yeah. TRA is not an alliance agreement, but there is treaty-like language in it. And that is quite significant. And I think China would view the U.S. as much more committed to becoming involved in Taiwan's defense than Russia would view the United States becoming involved in Ukraine's defense, right? And so I just think it's hard really to draw lessons from two situations that are very different, apart from the fact that there's a very sort of obvious superficial tie in the sense that depending on how one wants to characterize it, revanchist or other kinds of sort of longstanding sort of territorial objectives or sovereignty objectives, right? Russia essentially wants to reincorporate Ukraine, although Russia's commitment to that, I think, has varied quite significantly. Whereas with China and Taiwan, it's been clear since 1949 that the PRC views Taiwan as a part of China, and in that sense, it's a very troublesome, right, Chinese position. And if you're on Taiwan, I think one would be quite alarmed. But it's been a feature of kind of the international relations of East Asia for many, many decades in a way that I think Russia's designs on Ukraine appear to have been much more fluid and contextual. And so in that sense, I also think that the situations are not really kind of that easily compared. Though I could see why one, perhaps in Japan or elsewhere in the region, might be worried about the credibility of U.S. commitments or the willingness of the United States to become involved. But I think if one looks at the history, one would see that the U.S. has made very strong and sort of longstanding commitments to Taiwan that it's supported in many ways over the years that would be quite different from Ukraine.
That's certainly true. That statement by the Japanese leader was probably more political than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it reflects Japan's concerns and to some degree Japan's anxieties. Quite natural, right? I mean, Taiwan's much closer than Ukraine to Japan.
That's definitely true. In that case, Professor, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with? For example, maybe any thoughts on any black swans that might happen over the next year or so?
Well, the problem with black swans is they're known unknowns. So I would just say it's in some ways not a terribly stable situation, which means that smaller events could be perceived as having much greater strategic implications, although I wouldn't want to speculate as to what those events might be. I mean, the nature of a black swan is you don't really know what it is until it arrives. Yeah. It just underscores the importance of managing the disagreements over Taiwan as firmly as possible on both sides.
Yeah, that's something that we'll definitely have to look forward to in the next several months, especially as we expect a new administration to come in next January.
Right.
Yeah. In that case, thank you for your time, Professor.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions or topic you'd like us to tackle in the future, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe and we'll see you again.